What would you do if a creature that had every reason to fear you stepped onto a lonely road and asked without words for your help? On a quiet stretch of desert land, where dust heat and distance teach people to mind their own boundaries, one man believed in a single rule: observe, don't interfere. Nature, he thought, should be witnessed, not altered. But that belief begins to fracture the moment he encounters something that should not be there at all. A young white elephant alone, unmoving and unwilling to leave. It does not flee. It does not panic. It simply waits. What follows is not a rescue in the heroic sense, but a slow, punishing journey across land that offers no shortcuts, no guarantees, and no moral clarity. Each step forward tightens the question he cannot outrun when silence becomes a choice. What does it cost to keep walking away? Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Now let's begin the story. Ethan Walker left the preserve the way he always did, quietly, as if silence were part of his job description. The morning shoot had gone well. He'd been on a low ridge just before dawn, filming a small herd moving through a shallow wash where the desert still held onto night-cool shadows. The sky had opened from bruised purple into pale gold, and the animals had crossed the frame like something ancient and uncomplicated. Heads-down bodies steady the world, asking nothing of them but to keep living. That was what Ethan had always loved about this work. The honest rhythm of it. The rule that nature didn't need his opinion. His camera sat on the passenger seat, now padded in its case, the lenses tucked away, like sleeping eyes. He drove a dusty service road that cut through the far edge of the property, public land. On one side, the preserve's fenced boundary on the other. The road was red dirt, packed hard by tires and time, bordered by low, dry grass and thorny brush that clung to any hint of moisture. Farther out, mesquite trees held their crooked arms toward the sun, and the wind carried the warm smell of dust and creosote. It looked like every other morning. That sameness, beautiful, predictable, was a kind of protection. It was the reason Ethan could do this year after year without breaking apart. The moment you believed the wild was personal, you started making choices for it. And once you started making choices, you crossed a line you couldn't uncross. He'd learned that lesson early in his 20s, when he'd first traded a newsroom internship for a field camera. Back then, he'd believed the job was to rescue stories from obscurity, find a struggle, follow it, illuminate it. He'd believed that witnessing suffering came with an obligation to stop it. But the wild did not share that belief. The first time he'd interfered, he'd saved a young animal from drowning, only to watch it die a week later because it never learned how to avoid the river's pull. After that, he'd sat with a ranger who spoke gently but without mercy. "Your heart isn't the problem," the ranger had said. "Your heart just isn't the ecosystem." Since then, Ethan's principle had become a kind of spine: observe, don't touch. Record, don't steer. He could film a hunt, a storm, a broken leg, an empty nest. He could document it all with steady hands and still believe he was honoring the truth of nature by refusing to rearrange it. Distance, he told himself, was respect. Emotion was the most dangerous thing a conservation storyteller could carry. It made you want to rewrite outcomes. It made you forget you were a guest in someone else's world. So Ethan drove with his window cracked, letting the hot wind dry the sweat on his neck and let his thoughts fall back into their usual grooves, battery levels, memory cards. A note to himself about the light at dawn, the way the herd leader had paused and lifted her head, as if listening to something beneath the ground. A morning like any other. Then around a gentle bend, where the road dipped through a low arroyo, Ethan saw a pale flare ahead, something bright and wrong against the red earth. At first, he assumed it was sunlight, a piece of metal, a washed-out road sign. The desert played tricks when the heat started to rise. Light could split and shimmer, turning ordinary objects into mirages. But as he rolled closer, the shape did not dissolve. It held its place. Ethan's foot moved before his mind fully caught up. He hit the brakes hard. The tires skidded in the dirt with a dry hiss. The steering wheel shuddered under his hands. A cloud of red dust exploded outward and climbed the air like smoke swallowing the road ahead. He stopped with the suddenness of someone avoiding a catastrophe he hadn't yet named. For a moment, he could see nothing but dust. Then, the dust thinned. And in the middle of the road, no more than a few yards in front of his bumper, stood a calf. Not a deer, not a stray horse, not even a cow from someone's ranch. An elephant calf. White. Not the pale gray of dried mud or sun-bleached hide, but an eerie clean lightness that made it look carved out of the morning itself. Its ears were big and soft, the edges slightly pink, where blood vessels threaded close beneath the skin. Its body was small compared to a full-grown elephant, but still large enough that seeing it alone on this road made Ethan's stomach tighten. Its trunk hung low, then lifted slightly, tasting the air. The calf did not bolt. It did not wheel around and vanish into the brush. It simply stood there and looked at him directly, unflinching, as if it had been waiting. The world around them went strangely still. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if the desert itself had leaned in. Ethan stayed frozen behind the wheel. His mind ran through possibilities the way it always did when something didn't fit the rules. How did it get here? Where was the herd? This part of the preserve was remote, but not unreachable. The sanctuary had a controlled elephant range, a large fenced expanse, managed with strict protocols built for rescued elephants that could not return to overseas habitats. It was unusual, even controversial in some circles, but it existed funded by a patchwork of grants and donations and a stubborn belief that some lives deserved a second chance. Still, the range was miles from this road, and calves didn't wander alone. Ethan shut off the engine. The silence that followed felt heavier than sound. He hesitated with his hand on the door handle. Even approaching a wild animal carried risk to the animal as much as to him. One wrong movement, and he could push it toward panic, toward a bolt into danger. But the calf did something that made the decision for him. It lowered itself slightly, an awkward, careful bend of its knees, and let out a low sound that wasn't exactly a cry, not exactly a trumpet. It was deeper than Ethan expected, like a vibration pulled up from its chest. Then it reached out with its trunk and touched the hood of his vehicle, not striking it, not testing it, just laying its trunk there for a second, as if to confirm the car was real. The trunk lifted again and hovered. Ethan's throat tightened. The gesture was too deliberate to dismiss his curiosity. It had weight like intention. He stepped out of the vehicle, slowly keeping his body angled sideways, non-threatening the way rangers taught. The air hit him like an open oven. He could feel the heat rising already from the road. He stopped at a careful distance. The calf didn't retreat. It remained where it was, eyes dark and wide. It seemed to be holding itself together through sheer will. Ethan raised his hand slightly, palms open, and spoke in a voice he didn't entirely trust. "Hey," he said softly. "Hey there." The calf took a step closer. Ethan's pulse jumped. He held still. Another step. The calf's trunk lifted, trembling faintly, and then the tip of it touched Ethan's hand, light, brief, almost reverent. He felt the warm dampness of the skin, felt the subtle muscular intelligence inside it. Something in his chest shifted. Not fear, not wonder exactly. Recognition. This was not random. Elephants were social, protective, incredibly attentive to one another. A calf separated from its mother did not calmly approach a human unless it was desperate or unless it had learned that humans could mean help. Ethan swallowed. His principles rose up like a wall. Don't interfere. Don't turn the wild into a stage where you are the hero. But this wasn't the wild in the way he'd built his rules around it. This was a sanctuary, a managed range, a place already altered by human choices. The line had always been blurrier here, even if Ethan pretended it wasn't. He stared at the calf and heard himself whisper, barely audible, "You're not supposed to do this. And I'm not supposed to follow." The calf made that low sound again, closer this time. The trunk brushed his wrist, then withdrew. It turned its head slightly toward the brush lining the road. Then it took 3 steps away, stopped, looked back at him, waited. Ethan's mind tried to cling to logic. Maybe the calf was simply curious. Maybe it would wander off on its own if he didn't encourage it. Maybe, but the calf didn't leave. It stayed watching him, as if its entire body was an unanswered question. Ethan exhaled slowly. He lifted one hand, gesturing outward, a gentle shoo. No, he said more to himself than the animal. "Go back. Go." The calf did not move. It simply waited, and Ethan realized something that made his skin prickle. For the first time in his life, he did not feel like the one making the choice. He felt chosen. That was a dangerous sensation. It cut through reason and went straight into the soft places he'd spent years fortifying. He turned his head and looked back at the car. His camera case sat there like an invitation to do what he always did: document, remain apart. Capture the strange moment and drive away with the story. But something about that felt unforgivable. Ethan walked to the passenger seat, opened the door, and stared at the equipment for a long second. He could almost hear the old ranger's voice. "Your heart isn't the ecosystem." And yet another thought pressed in, undeniable. "If I leave now, I will be innocent. I will also be the man who watched a calf ask for help and did nothing." He shut the car door without taking the camera. Instead, he grabbed his field pack from behind the seat: water bottle, folding knife, emergency flare, a compact radio, a basic first aid kit. The things you carried when you told yourself you were prepared for surprises. He slung the pack over his shoulder and returned to the calf. It watched him. Still, patient. Ethan stopped again at a respectful distance. "All right," he said quietly. "All right, I'm here." The calf turned and began to walk away. Not fast, not frantic. Just a steady, determined pace. Ethan followed. The first steps felt like crossing a threshold in his own body, like stepping out of a life where he believed distance was always moral and into one where distance could become a kind of cowardice. The desert around them remained the same: red dirt, low brush, a sky bleaching brighter by the minute. But Ethan knew his place in it had changed. The calf walked, then paused, then looked back, checking that he still followed. Ethan kept his hands low, kept his voice silent. He did not touch. He did not lead. He simply walked behind a creature that should not have trusted him, and somehow did. If you were the only person on that road and saw this happen, what would you do? Would you walk away and tell yourself it wasn't your place, or stop and risk everything to help? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe before we step into the most powerful part of this story. The first hour was deceptively manageable. The terrain sloped gently away from the road into a wide expanse of cracked earth and scattered thorn bushes. The soil underfoot was baked hard, broken into plates that shifted slightly when Ethan stepped wrong. The brush was sparse enough that he could still see the calf at all times, and the calf's pace was slow enough that Ethan's lungs didn't burn. It almost felt like the calf had chosen him because it knew he could keep up. Then the sun climbed. Heat gathered on the back of Ethan's neck and pressed down like a hand. The sky turned a harsher shade of blue, bleached at the edges, as if the world itself were being dried out. The wind, instead of cooling, carried warmth and grit. The The calf's skin, so pale it seemed luminous, caught the sunlight and reflected it in a way that made Ethan squint. Occasionally, the calf would brush its trunk along its own side, as if soothing itself, and Ethan could see a faint tremor in its movements. He realized, with a small tightening of dread, that the calf's determination did not mean it had the strength for what it was attempting. Elephants didn't sprint their way out of trouble. They endured. They walked. They kept moving long after a human would have sat down and refused. The calf moved like that, like something too young to understand quitting. Ethan adjusted his steps to match it, keeping a distance that felt respectful without being useless. Close enough to intervene if it collapsed. Far enough not to crowd it. They passed through a low stand of mesquite where shade pooled briefly, and Ethan felt the calf slow, as if it wanted to linger in the coolness. But then it pushed onward again, leaving the shade behind with a stubbornness that made Ethan's chest ache. He thought about the range, about the sanctuary's protocols, about the perimeter fences meant to keep the elephants safe, about the staff who would be panicking if they realized a white calf had slipped away. A white calf. The thought returned with sharper edges now. Even in a sanctuary, even in the United States, rarity invited hunger. Not just the legitimate kind, photographers, donors, curious visitors, but the darker kind. The kind that measured life in dollars and inches. Ethan had filmed enough to know that poaching wasn't a continent-specific evil. It followed profit, not geography. He forced his mind back to the present. The calf continued through the scrub, angling slightly northeast, as if drawn by something beyond the horizon. Ethan began to note small signs, broken stems, a faint disturbance in dust, anything that might tell him whether the calf truly knew where it was going or was simply moving, because stopping was impossible. After another stretch of walking, he noticed the calf hesitate for the first time. It paused in an open patch of dirt, lifted its trunk high, and turned slowly in place. The tip of the trunk fluttered, tasting air, seeking scent. It took a few steps forward, stopped again, turned left, then back. A soft, low sound trembled in its chest. Not loud, not dramatic, but the sound of something trying to locate a memory. Ethan's heart sank. The calf was losing certainty. It moved toward a cluster of rocks, circled them, then returned to the same open patch. It pressed the tip of its trunk to the ground, inhaling sharply, then lifted its head as if confused by what it found. It let out a thin, plaintive rumble. Ethan crouched, scanning the ground like a tracker instead of a filmmaker. Dust held stories if you learned how to read them. A hoof scrape, a drag mark, a slight indentation, all of it mattered. At first, he saw only the calf's own prints, small and round, stamped unevenly from fatigue. Then beneath them, older and deeper, larger impressions. The unmistakable mark of an adult elephant. Ethan's eyes sharpened. He shifted his weight and followed the line of prints. They were not clean. Some were deeper on one side, as if the animal had been favoring a leg. In places, there was a faint smear, a dragged edge, the dust disturbed in a way that didn't match a normal step. And there were depressions where the ground had collapsed slightly, as if something heavy had stumbled. Ethan felt cold despite the heat. The mother hadn't simply wandered off and left the calf behind. Something had happened. He stood slowly, letting his gaze travel in the direction the tracks led. North, slightly east, into harsher terrain. The calf watched him trunk, lifted eyes fixed on his face, as if waiting for confirmation. Ethan swallowed. This way, he murmured, though he didn't know if it understood the words or just the movement. He stepped forward. The calf followed. For a while, the tracks remained clear enough that Ethan could lead without hesitation. The calf stayed close behind him now, trusting his direction the way it had wanted him to trust its earlier. It felt like a strange exchange of roles, and Ethan didn't know what to do with the tenderness that rose in him at the thought. They walked until the sun was high enough that the air itself shimmered. The rocks underfoot grew more frequent, and the brush grew meaner thorns that caught at his pants, brittle stems that scratched his forearms. The soil became loose in places, as if recently disturbed, and Ethan had to watch each step to avoid twisting an ankle. The calf's breathing grew louder. Its ears, once lively, drooped and flapped slower. At one point, it stumbled over a ridge of hard-packed dirt and caught itself awkwardly, knees splaying for a second before it regained balance. Ethan stopped instinctively. The calf swayed, then steadied. He reached for his water bottle and hesitated. His pack wasn't full. He'd left the road without preparing for a day-long trek. This had been a choice made in a moment of moral panic, not logistical planning. He unscrewed the cap anyway. He poured a small amount into his palm and held it out. The calf lowered its trunk and drew the water up with a soft, sucking sound. Ethan felt the calf's warm breath against his skin. He poured a little more carefully. Too much too fast could cause problems. He'd learned that from Dr. Grant once, watching her treat a dehydrated animal. The calf drank, then lifted its head, and blinked slowly, as if relieved, but still urgently pulled forward. Ethan raised the bottle to his own lips and took one small swallow, then stopped. The water tasted like plastic and minerals, but it was life. He screwed the cap back on and felt the bottle's lighter weight in his hand. A thought broke through him, sharp and clean. If I stop now, I stay innocent. If I continue, I'm responsible. He stared at the calf, at the pale hide that looked almost fragile in the brutal sun. Responsibility was a heavy word. It meant you could fail someone. It meant you could be the reason something lived or died. Ethan had spent years avoiding that kind of weight by calling it respect. Now the desert didn't care what he called it. The calf took a few steps, then paused and looked back. Ethan forced his legs to move. They pressed on. Time stretched into something thick and exhausting. The landscape did not offer mercy. No stream, no shade beyond thin patches under stunted trees. The heat built until Ethan's shirt stuck to his back and sweat dried so fast it left salt on his skin. The calf's pace slowed, then steadied, then slowed again. But it did not stop. And Ethan began to understand something he'd never fully grasped through footage alone. Elephants didn't endure because they were strong. They endured because they had to. Late afternoon, when the light began to soften slightly, Ethan saw the first vulture. It floated high above, circling without flapping, riding a current of air as if gravity were optional. Then another appeared. Then 3 more. They circled over a patch of land somewhere ahead, low and deliberate. Ethan's stomach tightened. Vultures did not gather for curiosity. They gathered for certainty, death, or the promise of it. The calf lifted its trunk and angled its head toward the sky. Its body tensed. Then, as if some invisible thread had pulled it, it turned sharply and began moving faster. Ethan stumbled after it, surprised by the sudden burst of speed. The calf's steps were still clumsy with fatigue, but the urgency in its posture was unmistakable. It was no longer wandering. It was homing. The terrain ahead changed, more broken brush, disturbed earth, the smell faintly metallic beneath the dust. Ethan noticed snapped branches, gouges in the dirt, as if something heavy had thrashed or fallen. Then he saw it. A depression in the ground that should not have been there. A patch of dirt that looked newer than the surrounding crust, as if it had been replaced recently. The brush around it was bent and dragged, unnatural in its pattern. The calf reached the edge and stopped abruptly. It let out a sound that made Ethan's throat close. A long, trembling rumble, not loud, but full of pain. Ethan stepped beside it and looked down. The pit was enormous, deep enough that the bottom sat in shadow even under the harsh sky. At the base of it lay a full-grown elephant, white. Her body was massive, even in stillness a fallen monument. Her side rose and fell faintly, slow breaths that seemed to cost her everything. One leg was positioned awkwardly, and even from above, Ethan could see a dark mark around it. Steel. A snare. His jaw tightened. He scanned the ground around the pit and found what he feared: thick wire, partially buried, anchored with crude stakes. A makeshift trap designed to hold something large until it weakened. Nearby, half hidden in dust, lay old shell casings, a scrap of plastic, a torn piece of cloth. This was not an accident. This was a decision someone had made. Ethan felt anger rise hot, immediate, almost dizzying. The calf leaned forward, trunk reaching downward toward the mother, making a soft calling sound. The mother's head shifted slightly. A faint response. The tip of her trunk lifted an inch and fell again. Ethan's hands shook. He reached for his radio. "Ranger Reed," he said, voice tight. "Ranger Thomas Reed, do you copy? It's Ethan Walker." A crackle. A pause. Then Reed's voice, calm but alert. "Walker, I'm here. What's going on?" Ethan swallowed. "I've got an elephant down. White female. She's trapped in a pit poacher's snare, severe dehydration. I'm sending coordinates now." He read them off with the precision of someone afraid that one wrong digit would become a death sentence. Reed didn't waste time with questions. "Copy. Dr. Grant is with us. We're rolling. 40 minutes, maybe less. Stay with her." Ethan exhaled sharply. "Copy." He clipped the radio to his belt and scanned the area again, suddenly aware of how exposed they were. The pit wasn't just a trap for the elephant. It was a mark on the land, a place where someone might return to collect what they'd caught. He looked at the calf. It stood, rigid eyes fixed on the mother, trembling in small, controlled ways. Ethan spoke without thinking. "Okay," he said softly. "Okay. We're going to keep her alive." He searched for a sturdy tree near the pit's edge and found a mesquite thick enough to hold rope. He tied one end around it, double-checked the knot, then anchored the rest around his waist and shoulders, the way he'd been taught for steep descents. He tested the rope, then lowered himself into the pit, carefully, boots scraping the dirt wall. As he descended, the air grew cooler, heavy with the smell of earth and sweat, and something faintly sour, fear maybe. The mother elephant's breath made a low sound, like a distant drum. When his boots hit the bottom, the ground shifted slightly under his weight, loose dirt crumbling. The elephant's eye opened a fraction. It was dark and glossy, rimmed with dust. It watched him with exhausted awareness. Ethan slowed his movements, making himself smaller. He kept his hands visible, palms open. He didn't approach directly. He moved in a gentle arc, giving her room. "Hey," he whispered, though he didn't know why. "It's okay." The words felt foolish. Nothing about this was okay. He opened his water bottle and poured a small amount into his palm. Then very carefully he stepped closer and held his hand near her mouth. Her trunk shifted, weak, hesitant. The tip touched his hand, found the water, drew it in. Ethan poured another small amount, then another. He watched the way she swallowed, the effort it took. He glanced at the snare around her leg. The wire was tight, dug into the flesh. He could see swelling and dried blood. He didn't have bolt cutters. He didn't have the right equipment. If he tried to remove it without expertise, he could worsen the injury, cause bleeding, cause panic. All he could do now was keep her alive. Above them, the calf's shadow moved along the rim of the pit. The calf made a low sound, almost constant, as if speaking to the mother in a language that held them together. Ethan felt his chest tighten. Minutes passed in a slow crawl. He rationed water carefully. He spoke to the elephant in a quiet voice, though he didn't know if the words mattered. Then a new sound threaded through the air. Faint at first, a low mechanical growl. Ethan froze. He tilted his head, listening. The sound came again, irregular, distant, as if a vehicle were moving slowly over rough ground. His pulse spiked. He looked up toward the rim of the pit. The calf had shifted position. It stood at the edge, facing outward, ears spread, body angled toward the direction of the sound. It didn't run. It didn't hide. It stood, as if it could become a wall. Ethan's throat tightened. He had no gun, no authority, no backup yet. If poachers returned now, he forced himself to keep breathing. He clipped the water bottle closed and spoke into the radio voice, low. "Reed, they might be coming back. I hear an engine." Reed's reply cracked through a second later. "Hold position. We're close." Ethan looked at the elephant mother and felt something settle in him, not calm exactly, but clarity. He could not leave, even if leaving would preserve his innocence. He adjusted the rope around his waist, ready to climb if he had to protect the calf. He listened. The engine sound grew clearer. The calf's low rumble deepened. Ethan whispered, not sure if he spoke to the elephant, the calf, or himself. "I'm here," he said. "I won't leave." The engine became more distinct until it stopped being a possibility and turned into a presence. Ethan climbed the rope quickly, hands burning boots, scraping dirt. He reached the rim and pulled himself up, rolling onto the hot ground and sucking in air that tasted like dust. He rose to his knees and looked out across the scrub. A pickup truck sat in the distance, half hidden behind a low rise. It hadn't come close enough yet to reveal faces. It was simply there, a dark shape against the bright land. No one got out. No doors opened. The vehicle idled like a predator, waiting to see if the prey was worth the risk. Ethan's mouth went dry. The calf stood several yards in front of him between the truck and the pit. Its ears were spread wide, making its small body look larger. Its trunk hung low but tense, the tip curled slightly, as if ready to lash. It did not charge. It did not retreat. It held its ground with a kind of still courage that made Ethan's eyes sting. Ethan stood behind it, feeling useless and too human. His hands were empty. His voice, if he raised it, would sound fragile in the open air. The standoff was silent. Heat pressed down. Dust hovered in the light. Somewhere far off, a bird called once, and then stopped as if it regretted making noise. Ethan stared at the truck and tried to imagine the people inside. Were they watching through binoculars? Were they debating whether to take the risk? Were they angry that their trap had attracted attention? The thought that someone could look at the pit, at a living, suffering animal, and see only profit made Ethan's jaw clench. Then from the far side of the land, a new sound cut through the quiet. A single sharp blast, a ranger's siren. It was not loud enough to feel safe, but it was loud enough to be heard. The truck's brake lights flickered. The engine revved. The vehicle turned slowly, as if offended to be interrupted. For a second it lingered, giving Ethan the impression that it could come back any time it wanted. Then it drove away, leaving a curling trail of red dust and the bitter, unmistakable smell of gasoline. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His knees trembled. He looked at the calf. It remained facing the direction the truck had gone, ears still spread, as if it didn't believe danger had truly passed, until the dust settled. Ethan didn't touch it. He didn't step closer. He simply stood in the space behind it, humbled by the fact that the smallest body there had been the bravest. In the distance, engines approached, multiple, now louder, purposeful. 2 vehicles crested the low rise, a ranger truck with its lights flashing, and a veterinary support vehicle with a small trailer carrying equipment. Ranger Thomas Reed climbed out first. He was tall, broad-shouldered, sun-worn, the kind of man who looked like he belonged to this land because he'd fought it and loved it long enough. His eyes went to Ethan, then to the pit, then to the calf. Jesus, Reed muttered, then moved quickly. Amelia Grant stepped out of the second vehicle, already pulling on gloves. Her hair was tied back, her face calm in a way that suggested she'd learned to place panic on a shelf. She looked at Ethan with quick, professional assessment. "You're Ethan Walker?" she asked. "Yes," he said, voice hoarse. "She's down there. Snared leg, severe dehydration." Grant nodded once. "You did the right thing, not trying to cut it without equipment." Reed's jaw tightened as he scanned the ground. "Poachers. Pickup truck," Ethan said. "They were here. They left when your siren hit." Reed's expression hardened. "We'll handle them. Right now, we handle this." The rescue unfolded with the focused urgency of people who had done hard things before. Grant and her team prepared a tranquilizer, speaking in low tones. Reed positioned 2 rangers as lookouts. Another rescuer, Lucas Hale Ethan, recognized him from the center, began assembling the hoist. Ethan stepped back when they told him to. He didn't argue. He understood suddenly that his role had been to bridge the gap between emergency and response, not to become part of the machinery of rescue. Grant approached the pit's edge and looked down. Her face softened briefly. "Hey, girl," she murmured, not for the elephant's sake alone, but perhaps for her own. She fired the tranquilizer with steady precision. Minutes passed. The mother elephant's breathing changed. Her body loosened into heavy surrender. Lucas and the crew lowered harnesses, carefully fitting them beneath the elephant's weight in a way that distributed pressure. The ropes tightened. The hoist creaked. The lift began. It was slow, deliberate, almost reverent. The elephant rose inch by inch out of the earth like a myth dragged back into daylight. The calf paced along the rim, making a constant low sound that Ethan felt in his bones. It reached its trunk toward the mother as she rose, touching the air, as if trying to hold her steady through sheer will. When the mother was finally out and lowered onto a padded surface, Grant moved in quickly, checking vitals, starting an IV, assessing the snared leg with tools Ethan didn't have. "She's alive," Grant said, voice clipped but relieved. "She's in bad shape, but she's alive." Ethan's chest released something tight and painful. The calf approached, immediately pressing its trunk to the mother's face. The mother's trunk twitched, then slowly lifted to touch the calf in return. It was not a dramatic reunion. No trumpeting, no cinematic flourish, just contact. Just proof that they still belonged to each other. Ethan stood back, hands hanging uselessly at his sides, and for the first time since morning, he felt tears prick his eyes. He blinked them away, embarrassed by his own softness, but Grant noticed anyway. She didn't comment. She just said quietly, "Thank you for staying." Reed approached Ethan, his voice low. "You did more than stay. You called. That matters." Ethan nodded, unable to find words that didn't feel too small. They loaded the mother, carefully securing her for transport. The calf was guided with calm patience into a second enclosure in the trailer, close enough to see and smell the mother. It protested briefly, then settled when it realized it wasn't being separated. Ethan watched the convoy roll away in a cloud of dust and sunlight, and only then did he feel his legs begin to shake from delayed exhaustion. The land looked the same again, red dirt, thorny brush, a sky too wide. But Ethan no longer believed same meant safe. Days passed and then weeks. The rehab center was a different kind of quiet than the open desert. Here there were fences, shade structures, water troughs, medical stations. The world was managed, protected, altered. Ethan visited when he could, but he did so carefully. Not like a man claiming a bond, but like someone paying respect. The first time he returned the calf, Ivory, the staff called it, lifted its head and stared at him the moment he stepped into view. It didn't rush forward. It didn't cry out. It simply watched, ears slightly spread, and Ethan felt that same strange sensation again being recognized. He stopped at the boundary line, marked by a low fence, and didn't cross it. Dr. Grant came out to meet him, clipboard in hand. "She's improving," Grant said. "Snowfall is stubborn. That helps." Snowfall, Ethan repeated softly, tasting the name. It fit the mother's pale presence, her stillness, the quiet power she carried even while injured. Grant glanced at him. "You gave her time. Time is everything with dehydration. And you didn't panic." Ethan looked past Grant to where Snowfall lay, under shade 4 line, taped carefully, her breathing steady. Ivory stood near her, occasionally touching her trunk to the mother's shoulder. Ethan's throat tightened. "Does she?" He nodded toward Ivory. "Does she understand what happened?" Grant's expression softened. Elephants understand more than people like to admit. Ethan didn't push further. He didn't need to. Over the next 2 months, Ethan returned sporadically, always the same. He stood at the edge, hands in his pockets, as if physical distance could keep the moment honest. Ivory always saw him. Sometimes the calf would step closer, then stop, as if remembering that closeness had once been necessary, but was not meant to become habit. The staff had trained Ivory to remain calm around humans, to accept medical checks, to respond to cues, but not to bond in a way that would make release impossible. Ethan respected that boundary. He came to understand that trust did not require possession. One afternoon, as Snowfall began to walk again, slow, careful steps with support, Reed found Ethan near the fence. Reed leaned on the rail, eyes narrowed against the sun. "We've got leads on the truck," he said. "Not enough yet, but we're tracking." Ethan nodded. "I keep thinking they'll come back." "They might," Reed said. "That's why we're strengthening patrols. A white elephant draws attention. You know that." Ethan swallowed. "Yeah." Reed looked at him for a moment. "You did good, Walker." Ethan exhaled. "I don't feel like I did anything." Reed snorted softly, not unkind. "That's the point. You didn't try to be a hero. You didn't make it about you. You showed up. You didn't turn away." Ethan stared through the fence at Snowfall, at Ivory. He thought about his old rule again: distance is respect. Maybe that had been true. But he understood now that distance could become an excuse too. A way to keep your hands clean while someone else bled. Respect, he realized, wasn't just staying out of the way. Sometimes it was staying. Release day came without ceremony. No press, no grand speeches, no banners. Just a warm morning, a small group of staff, Reed in his ranger hat, Grant with her calm hands, Lucas checking equipment, and Ethan standing behind the boundary fence as if he belonged to the background. They transported Snowfall and Ivory to the open range, still protected, still watched, but wide enough to feel like freedom. The landscape there was softer, dotted with larger trees and shallow water sources managed in a way that allowed elephants to live with dignity while staying safe from the world beyond. They opened the gate. Snowfall stepped out first. She paused, head lifted, trunk tasting the air. The sunlight fell across her pale hide, and for a second she looked unreal, like a story someone might tell to make the world feel less brutal. Then she moved forward. Ivory followed close, almost pressed against her, as if afraid the space between them might become a trap again. Ethan watched his chest, tight hands still. Snowfall stopped again, turning her head slightly toward him. Not toward the humans in general, toward Ethan. The distance between them was too far for contact, and Ethan was grateful for that. Contact would have made the moment about comfort. This moment was about return. Snowfall lowered her head slightly, a slow, deliberate gesture. Not submission, not affection the way humans understood it. Acknowledgement. Ethan swallowed hard. He didn't step forward. He didn't wave. He didn't call her name. He simply held still, offering the only thing he could offer without stealing anything from her witness. Snowfall turned away and continued. Ivory walked beside her, small and pale still, carrying the fragile stubbornness that had pulled Ethan off a road and into a decision he hadn't been able to explain. They moved across the grassland at a steady pace, bodies blending into the open land, their silhouettes softening with distance. Halfway to the low hills, Ivory stopped. The calf turned its head, looked back. Ethan felt the moment hook into him like a breath held too long. He stood perfectly still, afraid that any gesture, any wave, any sound would turn the calf's look into an invitation to return. He didn't lift his hand. He didn't say goodbye. He simply met the calf's gaze and let it be what it was, a brief recognition between two beings who had shared a crossing and were now returning to their separate worlds. Ivory turned back. The two white figures continued onward. They crested a slight rise, and then the land folded around them, and they were gone, absorbed into the same wide world that had almost taken them. Ethan remained at the fence long after the others began packing equipment and speaking in low voices. The wind moved through dry grass. A bird called once. The sun climbed as it always did. Nothing announced what had happened here. The desert did not carve a monument. The sky did not change its color to commemorate a choice. Ethan felt no triumph, only a quiet, aching clarity. He had not saved nature. He had simply refused to turn away when something that didn't belong to him asked to be seen. And when the road back to the center finally pulled him into motion, he walked with the kind of silence that was no longer distance, but respect earned, not assumed. Life returned to its place, continued without him. That was how he knew it was real. Some journeys don't end with answers, only with the quiet weight of what we chose to do when no one else was watching. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If it moved you, let us know by leaving a like or sharing your thoughts in the comments. And if stories like this about fragile lives, impossible choices, and the moments that shape us matter to you, consider subscribing and walking the next road with us.